Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to do a quick lecture on soil degradation and conservation. It's kind of a good follow-up on the very last lecture that we did, which covered soil structure and plant growth. These two lectures go very close, hand in hand. In a lot of ways, this is kind of a part B or part two to that lecture. So I wanted to continue going on, and if you haven't watched that lecture yet, watch that one before you jump into this one, just to make sure that you're fresh on the ideas that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so we'll be talking about soil degradation and conservation. That former lecture deals with the origins of soils, where they come from, what a healthy soil looks like, and how it operates. This talks about how these things can be disrupted. All right, so let's jump into this lecture, and I think you're going to really like it. So, damage to soil and land makes conservation vital. Conservation of soils, that is. It turns out soils are a natural resource that can be abused. It can be damaged to the point where it becomes non-renewable. It takes sometimes decades, sometimes hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years for soils to return after they've been improperly dealt with. So let's talk about what soil degradation is. So soil degradation is a decline in soil quality and productivity. This can occur due to deforestation, cropland agriculture, and overgrazing. Those are things that we mentioned in the last video, which is the reason why I was emphasizing you want to make sure that you watch that before you watch this one. Okay, so over the past 50 years, soil degradation has reduced potential food crop production by about 13%. Okay, so soils do lose their ability to give good, consistent, sustainable plant growth if they are not treated properly. Okay, so land degradation is a general deterioration of land, decreasing its productivity and biodiversity. So this could be due to erosion, nutrient depletion, right? So you're growing the same crop every single year and you're not returning the nutrients. That's going to wind up causing the productivity of the land to go down. Water scarcity, right? If you take the water and you funnel it off into a different direction, that could be a problem. Salinization, this is something we're going to learn a lot about today. Waterlogging and chemical pollution. Okay, so here we see a degraded, the soil is very strongly degraded in this field. In this case, it's mainly due to erosion, where the nutrients are being washed off. This fertile topsoil in the A horizon is being completely removed due to the way that the water is running off this field. There's no cover crop. There's nothing to protect it. Okay, we're going to talk about those things during this lecture over the next couple of slides. So what is erosion? So erosion is simply the removal of material from one place to another by wind or water. So here we see deep erosion in these gullies right here. Here's a creek of some sort. It's a dry creek. And in other words, it only probably has water in it when it rains or whenever there's a major storm event in the area. And then next to it, we see these deep erosion gullies that feed sediment down into that particular creek or river. Okay. Deposition is the arrival of eroded material at a new location. So here we see erosion, which is moving that material down into this creek. This creek is then going to transport the sediment. It's either going to be to the right or the left. I'm not sure which direction this creek goes, but it's going to move it away from this location, and it's going to deposit it at a new location. So the nutrients that used to be here won't be here for long. If it's eroded, they'll be transported elsewhere. As a consequence, flowing water deposits nutrient-rich sediment in river valleys and deltas. So wherever it's going is going to be the benefactor of the erosion that's happening here. Now this area here is not going to benefit, obviously. This is not a great place to grow crops because of the high level of erosion that happens here. As a consequence, floodplains are excellent for farming. And when we go to many of the great floodplain areas of the world, whether it be in China or it's in Egypt or if it's in the Midwest or in the Mississippi River Valley, we find a lot of crops growing into these floodplains, largely because the nutrients that are collected there, that nutrient-rich sediment, is very good for farming. Now, erosion today occurs faster than soil is formed, and this is a major problem. So if you're removing the soil faster than it's forming, you're going to get an imbalance, right? And it starts to become more non-renewable of a resource than a renewable one. It tends to remove the topsoil, which is of course the most valuable layer for plant growth. And again, we talked about that in the last video. That's that valuable O and A horizon right at the very top where all of the vibrant activity happens in soil. Now, in terms of how erosion threatens ecosystems in agriculture, there's a lot of ways it could happen. First off, windy regions with sparse plant cover suffer from wind erosion. And so this is a common issue in deserts, for example. Areas with steep slopes, these are hillsides, right? High precipitation and little plant cover suffer from water erosion as well. So if it's raining all the time, you don't have the plant growth to hold everything down, you're going to get a huge amount of things washing off those hills. This is a common problem in places like the Himalaya, northern India, where you have high mountains. Even in parts of the Rocky Mountains, we have issues like this in the United States. Land is made more vulnerable to erosion through a couple of different things that humans can do. Over-cultivating fields through poor planning or excessive tilling is one way. So if you're not being careful about the way that you're going about your tilling, you can absolutely destroy that field. A lot of the time we think, well, if I come out and I till this field, I'm actually tending it, I'm taking care of it, when in fact we can be doing the exact opposite. We'll explain that point in a little bit. We could overgraze rangelands, and we could do clearing of forests on steep slopes or with large clear cuts. So if we're going to go out and, say, collect a bunch of wood because we need the wood for building buildings or whatever it is we need it for as a raw material, and we just cut all the wood down, that suddenly leaves a bald spot that can then be subjected to immense amounts of erosion. Overall, U.S. croplands lose about 2.5 centimeters, which is about 1 inch. So it's about the width of your thumb. If you have a large thumb, it's about 1 inch of topsoil every 15 to 30 years. So that's a lot, right? In some places like the Amazon rainforest, you might, in a thick A horizon might only be 8 inches thick, right? So it won't take you very long to work your way through it. And in some places, the A horizon is completely missing. So you just have O sitting right on top of B. When that happens, you wipe out what's there very, very quickly. So you have to be very, very careful with how erosion works. All right, so things that we can do to prevent soil loss include the way that we manage our agriculture, specifically how we grow our plants. So plants prevent soil loss by slowing wind and water flow. So you can imagine that if water is going to fall, let's say it's raining, the water is going to hit these leaves. The velocity of that water is going to be slowed down. It's going to drip down these plants. The plants are actually going to absorb a large amount of that water out of that field. But in addition to that, and as a consequence, it won't run off as quickly. It'll slow, and it'll actually soak into the ground as opposed to running off the surface. In addition to that, it'll actually break up wind erosion, so wind could be whistling along here right across the top of these crops, but it's not down here where the soil is. If the wind started moving quickly down near where the soil is, it would actually come into contact with these plants. These corn stalks would actually break up that wind and slow it down. Okay, so it turns out roots hold soil in place. It's very effective at doing that. It keeps it from moving. Plants have a vested interest, of course, in not having the soil move around on them because they're anchored to it, and as a consequence, they bind that soil. No-till agriculture leaves plant residues on crops or on fields. So one of the things you could do is, instead of tilling the field all the time, which rips up the soil and exposes it to the atmosphere, what you can do is you can just let the cuttings from the previous year, let's imagine that we have these corn stalks, we go and we collect all the corn, and then we just cut the corn down and we let it fall back down into the field and decompose. That creates a ground cover, okay? And that ground cover helps prevent erosion. Another thing we could do is cover crops. So cover crops protect soil between crop plantings. So here we see corn that is growing, but there's a cover crop in here, mainly radishes and turnips that are growing in here as well. And what that does is it helps bind the soil when we're not growing corn, which is the primary agricultural product they're growing here at this location. Okay, so that cover crop protects the soil between crop plantings, and U.S. farmlands lose about 5 tons. This is a big deal. 5 tons of soil for each ton of grain harvested. That's an immense amount of expense to the topsoil. So for you, think about that. For every ton of grain, you're losing 5 tons of soil. That's not sustainable. That's not supposed to happen. If you produce a ton of grain, you're not supposed to lose any soil. That's the goal, right? You don't even want it to be 1 to 1. You want it to be 0 tons of soil loss for every ton of food grown. Sustainable soils do not have these problems. All right, so what are the consequences of mismanagement of the soil? Well, desertification is one of these things. So desertification is a form of land degradation with more than a 10% loss of productivity. So this means that 10% of the biomass is reduced. You can't grow nearly as much food. You won't get as much plant growth out of it. And you'll see that once desertification starts to happen, it will accelerate and get worse and worse. And eventually, the end game is it becomes a desert, right? So desertification is the process of becoming a desert. Commonly are caused primarily by wind and water erosion, but also by deforestation, soil compaction, and overgrazing as well. Another common way of seeing this happen is drought, right? So droughts are actually pretty normal, and desertification will happen whenever there's a drought. But the way that we manage the conditions of that drought can be a big deal as well. Because if it's a very dry drought, in other words, it's lack of water, but we go and maybe we force water into the field that normally shouldn't be there during a drought condition, you can create something called salinization. You can actually salt that field by accident. And another thing that might happen is water depletion, right? Those all will cause desertification. And of course, climate change. Any type of climate change. If you raise the temperature up in an area that is susceptible to desertification, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment, these things called drylands are especially prone to this. You can create large amounts of stress on that soil, on that field, and on that land. Okay, so arid and semi-arid lands called drylands are the most prone to desertification, and they're not a small part of the earth. It's about 40% of the Earth's land surface. Okay, that's a lot. How much of it is caused by wind erosion? About 41.8% according to this plot that we have here, and water erosion about 45.2. We also have chemical problems, your salinization, and soil structure problems that also happen. This could also be caused by the way that we're pulling plows through the soil and ripping up that A horizon, which normally has good structure in it. We rip that structure up, and it'll actually make it susceptible to erosion. So we should be very careful about what we're doing. All right, so how do we come to learn about this stuff? Why do we care so much about soil degradation? Well, when we really had the biggest eye-opening experience about soil degradation was when something called the Dust Bowl happened, especially in the United States in the 1930s. The Great Depression was already happening. And during the middle of the Great Depression, suddenly a large series of dust storms started to form throughout the Midwest of the United States. This was a complete shock to anything that had happened prior to that. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, farmers and ranchers, they grew wheat, they grazed cattle, they used unsuitable land and removed native grasses, but they didn't think there was anything wrong with that, right? There had never been a problem before. They just saw the soil as this limitless bounty that would always produce the grasses that they needed to take care of all of their life. And what happened was, out of the blue, something called the Dust Bowl. Massive dust storms from erosion of millions of tons of topsoil in the 1930s. Drought also came in and it worsened the human impacts, and dust storms traveled up to 2,000 kilometers, which is about 1,250 miles. Thousands of farmers left their land. Many of them went from, in the case of the United States, from Oklahoma. Many of them moved to California. So California began to become very settled by people from the Midwest right about that time in response to that. And there's several great novels about that. So study your American history and you'll come up with that information. Of course, the Dust Bowl didn't only happen here. There were dust events that happened worldwide. But what was really interesting was it happened in the United States in an area where it had never happened before, and it opened people's eyes to the fact that we can abuse the earth so badly that it basically collapses on us. Okay. So what we did was in the United States was to establish a soil conservation service. So That happened in 1935. And the service works with farmers to develop conservation plans for individual farms. So basically, the idea is to come out and to prevent this from ever happening again. And you do it through education and by showing better ways of these things happening, taking into consideration the risks of activities that we're doing and where that might lead. Ultimately, we developed a series of conservation districts. These are districts that promote soil conservation practices at the county level. They operate with federal direction, authority, and funding, and are organized by the state. So this is a state, local, federal collaboration that's designed to bring people together to worry about the soil, to be concerned about the soil, and to try to conserve the soil. And in 1994, the service was renamed the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the responsibilities expanded to also include water quality protection and pollution control. And this became a model for a lot of the services that we see across the world. Okay, soil is not something we could take advantage of and take for granted. This is a resource that can be absolutely devastated if we don't pay attention to what we're doing. So some of the ways that we can protect soils some of them are pretty innovative and some of them are kind of obvious. One thing that's been around for a very long time is crop rotation. So crop rotation is where we're growing different crops from one year to the next. So this returns nutrients to the soil because instead of growing corn, which might extract certain nutrients preferentially but leave the others, which then depletes it, what you do is you're constantly rotating different plants in the areas that use different nutrients in different amounts, and therefore it gives the soil the opportunity to rest between plantings. Okay, it prevents erosion and reduces pests. If you have a lot of the same thing in an area, you're going to attract the pests of that thing. So if you're always growing corn in a field every single year, then if you say in year one you're going to grow corn, you might not have a problem. By year 2, year 3, year 4, the pests are going to start to build up to the point where you maybe have to use pesticides to be able to deal with the problem. Through crop rotation, it's possible that you might have a little bit of pest problem maybe in year 1 or year 2, but then as you rotate that back out, then the pests who maybe, let's say it's a pest that is attracted to corn, and then you rotate in instead of corn, soybeans, you might not get as many pests in that field because they haven't established themselves at that location yet. Like crop rotation, no-till farmers may alternate wheat or corn with nitrogen-fixing soybeans. And that's actually a pretty common practice in a lot of places that engage in crop rotation. Contour farming is another kind of interesting thing. That this is really designed for stopping erosion. So here we see contour farming, and so we see these furrows going around and around and around. And what they're doing is they're plowing furrows sideways across the hillside perpendicular to its slope. And the reason why is they don't want the water to run right off the hill and create water erosion and hillside erosion. What they're doing is they're actually trapping the water, forcing it into the soil so the water has value to those crops, while at the same time preventing erosion. So contour farming is another way that we can do this. And another thing that's been going on for a very long time, that's a very old practice, is terracing. Terracing is cutting level platforms into steep hillsides. So here we see terracing here. The steps of this staircase do hold large amounts of water. Now, on the one hand, this allows you to go and grow a tremendous amount of food right here in these terraces, and you can feed a lot of people in this way. On the flip side of this, it's also extremely dangerous because now you have water and mud sitting on these terraces, on these hillsides, and if it fails, remember this is a lot of water, so it's a lot of weight, a lot of soil, a lot of weight's going to be there, and if it fails, it's going to catastrophically go down into the valley, and it could cause a mudslide that would take many lives. So terracing has its ups and downs, but for the most part, it's a good way to begin feeding large numbers of people using land that is normally not available to us, because hillsides, they erode easily. It's hard to access. Terracing seems to correct that problem. Another process that we've picked up is intercropping. So instead, sometimes you might say, well, I don't want to just grow corn this year, and I don't want to just grow soybeans. I want to grow several things. And so we can intercrop, which is, of course, a form of polyculture. So intercropping is planting different crops in alternating bands or mixed arrangements. This increases the ground cover and it prevents erosion by doing so. It decreases pests and disease because you're bringing in so many things that the pests don't really build up on one thing. And even then, those pests might compete with each other for that particular area. So there's a natural suppression of the pests in that area. And then you'll also get the replenishment of the soil over time, because you might move these crops year after year to different spots in the farm, while at the same time growing all of these things at the same time. Shelter belts are also known as windbreaks in the western part of the United States, but shelter belts are rows of trees that are planted along the edges of fields to slow the wind. When I was growing up in Southern California, windbreaks were all over the place. They were usually planted with eucalyptus trees, which were imported from Australia. So they're non-native to the United States, but it turns out they're very effective at stopping the wind. And it's not uncommon to see them. These are shelter belts right here. And so here's the farm or the field, and then the wind is blocked by these tall trees that hedge in or block in that field. And it can be combined with intercropping. So you could take intercropping, you can take a field like this one here, and you could shelter belt it. You could put these tall trees all around it. Another thing that you could do to stop a lot of the erosion and the degradation is conservation tillage. So this is strategies that reduce the amount of tilling relative to conventional farming. So this usually entails leaving at least 30% of crop residues in the field. And then, of course, if you did no-till farming, this is where you're leaving all the residues in the field, and then you don't till it. You don't plow that field year after year. You just come back and you grow it again. So what we see here is conservation tillage happening here, where there's still some of that old material from the previous year's growth is still in that field. It is now part of the O-horizon. It's decomposing, and it's becoming part of the fertility of that field in the next year. Okay. A lot of fields and a lot of farmers, they remove all of that stuff. And so the fertility has to be returned through fertilizers, which can be quite expensive. And of course, if you don't put some type of cover crop or something that's going to protect that field, it might be subjected to erosion during the wintertime. Sometimes no-till farming, where you just let the material die after you've harvested the fruit part of it. Let's say it's corn, you're going to remove the corn, let the stalk fall into the field and become part of that O-horizon, which then introduces the fulvic and humic acids and decomposition and all the nutrients back into that soil. And you need minimal amounts of fertilizer when you're doing that type of thing. So that's what we mean by conservation tillage. So in fact, here's a nice diagram or a nice image of a no-till farmer that's growing corn. So no-till farming has many benefits. It increases the organic matter and soil biota. It reduces erosion and improves soil quality. So this field, by most people's guess or most people's estimate of how fields should look, looks like a mess, right? There's all this stalk down here. It's almost like the farmer didn't clean up after himself. In fact, here's the farmer. It almost looks like he's lazy. But what's really happening here is it's actually a concerted effort. It's actually quite intelligent. What we're doing is we're growing corn. Last year's corn crop is dead. It's falling in here. The corn was harvested off this, and now it is part of the fertility into that field. It uses less labor, right? You don't have to go cut that stuff down, bale it up, and haul it out of the field. It saves time, right? Because all you have to worry about and focus on is growing that corn and getting the corn, the actual corn itself, removed where the stalk can remain behind. And it causes less wear on machinery. In a lot of cases, all you need to do is come in and pick the corn, and then you leave the stalks in the field and you go past it. You don't have to come in and till it up. You don't have to change it. You just leave it as it is. And we have a wonderful film that I'm going to recommend at the end of it, that it gets into why no-till farming is actually better than coming in and plowing that field every single year. And I highly recommend that you watch it. Look out for that recommendation at the end of the film. It also prevents carbon from entering the atmosphere. So it's a carbon storage, right? So all of this, the old corn stalks here, are remain in place. They haven't been burned, they haven't been turned into fuel, they haven't been turned into food, and they're therefore not radiated back into the atmosphere through the metabolic processes of the cattle that might be eating it or whatever. Okay. Reduces fossil fuel use due to less use of tractors. You can see that there's not a whole lot of tractor use here. Adds organic matter to soils that is kept from the atmosphere. It's got a little reference here to the science of soil health, which is something that you can Google up, and it should have a little bullet point over here. If you're interested in soil health, no-till is one of those things that comes up right away. All right, so from the previous slides, I think it's pretty clear that plant cover is the key to erosion control. There's a lot of methods that we can use to reduce erosion. And the main key, or the main point of a lot of this stuff, is simply to keep the plant cover in place. If you keep it there, you don't get the erosion. Things stabilize very easily and very quickly. So what you can do is you can move livestock to prevent overgrazing. So if you have cattle coming through and eating everything in the area and eating all the vegetation down to just maybe a little nub, maybe about an inch tall. And that does happen in places. I'll actually show you an image where that's happened. You'll realize very rapidly that erosion can very easily take root and wash all that soil away. You cut fewer trees in an area rather than clear cut. So if you're going to remove wood, which does happen when we have to harvest certain areas, and there's different reasons why that might happen. It might happen for forestry reasons, for fire safety, I should say, in forestry. But there's also just the natural resource needs of people. Sometimes it's better to go ahead and take a couple of trees out of an area rather than take them all. If you just take select trees, you can reduce that erosion, and then when you grow back new growth, you won't have the erosion. You can actually have sustainable forest that's constantly giving you that natural resource. You can also plant vegetation along riverbanks and roadsides, and you frequently do see that. You can imagine a road, when it rains, it collects a lot of rainwater that runs off to the edges, and there's a tremendous amount of erosion that usually happens along roadsides. That's the reason why you usually see either a gully or some type of gutter that's installed there, because the erosion can be extremely intense. Well, if you don't have those things in place, it's best to have some kind of vegetation there in place to prevent the erosion from taking root and wiping out the road. So it's actually a very good way to do it. Here we're seeing plants being intentionally grown in rows on this hill slope, and this is designed to keep the hill slope from failing due to erosion sliding things down. All right, so we just talked about the way that animals can graze things down to almost nothing. What we're seeing here in this picture is an overgrazed and undergrazed area. So let's talk about this. So grazing animals on rangeland can be sustainable if the total number of grazing animals is kept below the rangeland's carrying capacity. And you remember we talked about carrying capacity in one of our previous lectures. Overgrazing occurs when too many animals eat too much of the plant cover, and it impedes plant growth. And so when we look over here, we could see this, right? The left side of this place, this is in the Carrizo Plain Ecological Reserve, this left side of the image has clearly been eaten down, right? It's been overgrazed. On the right, this is what it would look like had the cattle not come through at all. This is ungrazed, completely ungrazed over here. So here we see it's basically a flat desert with no vegetation at all. And here we still see some low-level vegetation. There's not a whole lot that normally grows out here anyway. But what is here is holding the soil in place. On the other side, the soil has changed color. It's going to erode at some point. It's going to be a major problem. This soil is exposed, allowing erosion, less regrowth, and positive feedback of more erosion. So non-native invasive species also tend to invade, right? So you're going to get non-native species that come in. Livestock do not like to eat these weeds or these non-native species. And so as a consequence, they'll eat the native and not the non-native, and therefore the non-native are then completely allowed to take over the area. This will outcompete the native vegetation. Trampling is another thing that happens. It compacts the soil and it prevents water infiltration. And that prevention of water infiltration goes back to erosion again. So the water can't soak in, it runs off, it carries the soil with it. It's just basically what we call a bad all around, right? It's a bad all around situation. So overgrazing can degrade soil. We just kind of showed you that. That's the name of the slide here. Degraded rangeland costs over $23 billion worldwide. So there is a very strong economic cost to us. We feel that in the price of our food. We feel that in the availability of certain meats. Things that would normally be available to us at the market are suddenly more expensive. Grazing exceeds the sustainable supply of grass in India by 30%, and in parts of China by up to 50%. In terms of the U.S. government subsidies increase harm because ranchers pay little to graze their animals on public lands. And you would say, well, what difference does that make? If there's a public land and the ranchers are out there, what that does is it creates something called the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is the phenomenon that people tend to use common land or common use things very differently than they would use their own, right? It's the old adage that people spend other people's money differently than they spend their own. And that's exactly what we deal with when we're dealing with ranchers. When ranchers have the chance to put their cattle into their own pasture or out on government pasture where it's free, they always put it on government pasture until that resource is used up, and then they'll bring it onto their own pasture. The consequence of this is that you see the tragedy of the commons. Public areas or publicly or commonly owned areas tend to get degraded very rapidly. Whereas if a rancher has the cattle on their own land, they have a very high motivation to make sure that overgrazing doesn't happen because they want their farms to operate sustainably. Okay, and so here we see a large amount of this happening. This is a grazing operation. Happy Canyon is the name of this in Los Padres National Forest. And they're basically running out here. This is on a public land. And here we could see that cattle, while it's eating grass down here, there's not a whole lot of stuff around these trees. Pretty much anything that is up high has to be above the height of the cattle's neck to be able to grow. Everything else has been completely chewed down. Ranchers are now working with environmental scientists on ways to raise livestock more sustainably. And one of the ways that we can do that is get involved in grass-fed beef production. That's a growing area in the meat market. People are demanding it. One, it's healthier, not only for humans, but it's also healthier for the animal. It's also healthier for the land. And there's different ways that we're doing this. Another culprit in the degradation of soils is irrigation. So irrigation is the artificially providing water to support agriculture. And so here we see an agricultural field, and here we see it's undergoing some type of irrigation. What this does is it makes unproductive regions become productive farmland, right? So if this was in the middle of the desert, which normally couldn't grow anything, suddenly if you irrigate it with water from, say, a local river, then all of a sudden you can grow a tremendous amount of food in an area that used to not be productive at all. You can grow water-intensive crops like rice and cotton. You'd be surprised at how much rice and cotton, for example, is grown in the deserts of the United States. It's incredible. If you have good fertile soil, but without water, you can't grow anything. But if you're able to get the water to the right places, you can grow a tremendous amount of crops like rice and cotton, which take a large amount of water. 70% of all fresh water used by humans, 70% of all, goes to irrigation. It's not for drinking, it's not for toilets, it's not for brushing your teeth, it's not for doing any of that stuff. It's for putting out into these fields and growing the things that we eat. Okay? And as a consequence, it can deplete aquifers and dry up rivers and lakes. And we've seen this happen worldwide. If you take the water out, for example, the Colorado River in the United States, there are definitely times that the Colorado River of the United States does not make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean or to the Gulf of California, which then feeds into the Pacific Ocean, because the water is siphoned off and diverted into agricultural fields in the United States. So it creates tremendous problems. So one of the ways that we can deal with this is to look at alternative irrigation systems. In other words, match irrigation to whatever the need is. So what we can do is we can match crops to the climate. So instead of growing cotton, for example, in Arizona and California, let's try growing these crops in Georgia or Florida or Texas, where they grow normally anyway, right? So we don't need to necessarily grow them in dry climates, but that doesn't mean we're not doing it anyway. We are growing cotton in very, very, very dry and water-intense areas where it's not readily available. California produces a tremendous amount of cotton. Um, Growing cotton in dry climates requires extensive irrigation, while wheat does not. Okay. In conventional irrigation, like flood and furrow, and by the way, this is flood and furrow. Let me go back to this. This is flood and furrow. So these are the furrows, and basically they flood this entire field with water. In conventional irrigation, like flood and furrow, and sprinklers, so here's a sprinkler down here, as little as 43% of the water applied is used by the crops. So that's a lot of water to put out for less than half of it to actually get into the crops. By contrast, drip irrigation, and here we see drip irrigation. This is a pipe right here, and there's a little spot. Here's the plant that it's watering. Come back to it here in a moment. The water's coming out, and it's falling right directly on that plant. So drip irrigation targets water directly to plants, and plants use as much as 90% of that water. So that means that you don't have a whole bunch of wasted water as a resource, but additionally, you're not degrading the soils as intensely as you would during a flood and furrow style irrigation. And if you tend to use too much water, you can get something that's also very bad. It's called waterlogging. So waterlogging is experienced by over-irrigating soils when the water table rises to cover and suffocates the roots. This is the kind of field that nothing is going to grow in effectively. And in fact, you can see where the waterlogged soils are. The groundwater is so high and it's so saturated, the water can't even soak in. It's just over-irrigated. There might have been a couple of storm events that came in and exacerbated the problem, but here it is. And you'll notice that right where the water is, nothing's growing. This is a dead zone. There's another dead zone right out over there. This field is essentially dealing with some real problems. This is waterlogging, and plants can drown in water. And kind of on the flip side of that is salinization. So salinization is where you can get buildup of salts, and this happens when you have a large amount of water that is being used in an area improperly, and then what happens is the heat in an area, so a very arid environment in particular, evaporates off the water, and it leaves the salt that's been drawn out of these waterlogged soils, and it basically crusts everything with salt. And of course, as we all know, nothing grows in salt. So evaporation pulls salts up from the lower soil horizons. It is easier and cheaper to prevent salinization than to fix it. So just don't make the mistakes, right? Do not plant water guzzling crops in sensitive areas. Irrigate with low salt water, okay? Irrigate efficiently and only as much as needed. This is due to over irrigation. This is too much water that causes this. Fixing requires flushing soils with large amounts of water. So then you got to take fresh water, you got to dump it in, you got to flush it out, and even then you're not guaranteed a result. Most of the time farmers just walk away from it and they hope that eventually the rains over a period of time will wash it out. Okay, but here we see this salt has encrusted this soil, and you can see there's a tremendous amount of difficulty for these plants to grow and survive here. All right, so the other thing that can happen is we can apply fertilizers to these fields, right? So we've got damaging effects of the topsoil, and so one of the things we got to do is we got to come in and add nutrients. So a fertilizer is a substance containing essential nutrients. So remember, plants require nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and remove them from the soil, possibly limiting their growth. So if, you know, that's the reason why you don't have an unlimited amount of forest in an area, because there's only so many nutrients at that location. There's a lot of competition for those nutrients. They're getting drawn away. Now, there's two different ways that we generally return fertilizers back, or we fertilize the soil. Inorganic fertilizers, which are usually mined or synthetically manufactured mineral supplements. These are produced by chemical companies, and they're sprayed around in the field. In fact, this is what we see here. This is a gentleman that's spraying a chemical fertilizer in this field. Probably trying to introduce nitrogen out there, but I'm not exactly sure what it is he's spraying. It's usually nitrogen. And it's from some chemical plant. Or there's organic fertilizers, which is the remains or wastes of organisms. This includes manure, crop residues. Remember those old corn stalks I was showing you earlier. Fresh vegetation could be an organic fertilizer. And of course, compost is another thing. A lot of people really like to get involved in composting. And here we see compost right over here. This is organic compost. It's a mixture produced when decomposers break down organic matter. And you can take that compost and you can turn it into the field. And so that's what's happening here, is this is being used to grow stuff. So this is a fertilizer, a natural organic fertilizer. So fertilizers do have their benefits, right? And whether they be organic or they're inorganic, they do have their benefits of increasing plant growth by putting those nutrients into the soil. Now, traditional agriculture relied on organic fertilizers, but the Green Revolution brought on increased use of inorganic fertilizers. And we talked about the Green Revolution in the last video. So again, if you haven't watched that, you need to watch that video before you trudge through this one here. Inorganic fertilizers are more susceptible to leaching and runoff. They don't absorb into the soil as well. They're not kind of part of the ecosystem already. They're kind of more like chemical pellets that are thrown out into the field or sprayed out there. And as a consequence, it can wind up in the runoff, right? It can run off into surface waters far from the point of application, causing dead zones and water bodies. So here we can have a tractor that's spraying their inorganic fertilizer. The result is you might have nitrous oxides that are coming straight off the field. The inorganic fertilizer can wash off and become runoff. These are things that you don't necessarily want in your bodies. There's things that you don't necessarily want in the food that you eat. So if it goes into a lake or a river where you're collecting fish, that's something that should be of concern to you. And it can get into there, not just over the surface, but it can also get into the groundwater system. It can contaminate the groundwater. That's what these blue dots here in this diagram are representing. So it's going to get down here and it'll wind up in the lake that way. So possibly too many fertilizers can be a major problem. Inorganic is worse, right? But you still don't want to use too much of any type of fertilizer. You want the right amount. Okay? So nitrates volatilize into the air and contaminate groundwater. Nitrates and phosphates in drinking water can cause cancer and blue baby syndrome in infants. So these fertilizers don't come without a cost. There's an absolute cost imposed on us if we use them, and it's imposed on the environment as well. Now, one of the goals that we have is sustainable fertilization of the soils, right? So a self-sustaining soil should have sustainable fertilizers. So sustainable fertilizer use involves targeting and monitoring nutrients. So nutrients can be added to the drip irrigation and are delivered directly to plants, as opposed to just spraying it out into the field behind a tractor, right? Just add it straight to the water supply. You're already using a very smart drip irrigation system. Put it directly into the water. No-till planting allows the application of fertilizers with seeds rather than spreading it across the soil, right? So then you can just put it right where you need it, if you need it at all. You might not even need it at all. Monitoring of soil nutrients can prevent unneeded applications. And this is what we see here. This is a soil core that can be used for doing soil chemistry. So if you were in one of my face-to-face classes where you were actually on my campus, I take my students out frequently and we collect soil cores and we do soil chemistry to see what the nitrates are, what the nitrites are, how much ammonia is in there, what the pH is, soil color. You name it, we're working on it. Phosphates is another thing we look at, and several other parameters. And potassium is another one. So that's something that we can do. And it turns out you can actually do this pretty easily and effectively yourself. Soil testing kits are quite cheap these days. You can order them online and you can have them shipped to you. And you can find out what the soil quality of your home or wherever you work or whatever your field is. You can get that checked very quickly and very cheaply. Organic fertilizers provide needed nutrients as well as improving the soil, improving soil structure, then increasing nutrient holding capacity, and increasing the water retaining capacity. Remember, that's that organic material that's in there that does that. All right. So one of the other things that we've given up in our pursuit of agriculture are our wetlands. So wetlands are defined as swamps, marshes, bogs, river floodplains. And in the United States, over 50% have been drained for agriculture. And there's reasons that go beyond that. But agriculture is the main reason. And in other countries, it's actually worse in some situations. Some countries, it's not as bad. But it turns out these wetlands are almost always looked at as a great place for growing things. Government policy in the United States led to something called the Swamp Lands Acts in 1849, 1850, and 1860. And what they were doing was draining and converting wetlands to control floods and malaria. So here we see a wetland over here, and you can imagine there's a large number of mosquitoes in the area, and mosquitoes carry malaria. So they would wipe out these wetlands, turn them into agricultural fields, and they would kind of pat themselves on the back. The problem is that it turns out these wetlands are very, very good at cleaning soils and cleaning water. They're natural cleaning systems. They're natural filter systems in the environment. And so they're extremely important. Wetlands are now seen as vital ecosystems for habitat. They control flooding. They recharge water supplies. It's amazing how clean a wetland can make water. You can take a bunch of dirty water in one end of the wetland, and it'll come out perfectly clean on the other side if you have a vibrant ecosystem working there. Now, the wetland biomass quickly removes fertilizer from water. When we say fertilizer, we mean all those fertilizers that come in artificially, but it also includes all the manure and animal waste that comes out of people's backyards and things like this. Trust me, it's pretty crazy what you'll find flowing into the river systems of many cities, and what a wetland can do with that material once it gets to it. So it's impressive. In the United States, we have something called the Wetlands Reserve Program, which is where landowners are paid to protect, restore, and enhance wetlands. So it's a way to make money. And we're starting to see the restoration and even the creation of new wetlands for the purposes of cleaning water. And as that experiment happens in the United States, we're starting to see that experiment also happen in other places independently. And we're starting to see in some countries where we thought water quality was going to not recover anytime soon, that it's making a very rapid turnaround in natural ecosystems. But we have to be on our guard because there's a tremendous amount of waste still going into the natural environment. And we're still losing the soils, we're still losing the rivers, and we have to be vigilant, okay? Now, if you're interested in soil conservation, and if you're interested in soil structure and any of this stuff, the master of all of this is Dr. Ray Weil. His interview, which he gave at this YouTube link right here, and I'll also put it down in the above the, I guess it's in the comments down below this video. I'll put a link there. You should check him out. It's a very short, I think 11, 12 minutes, but if you're interested in soils, again, he's the master, and he can absolutely open your eyes on this question of no-till and for example, why is no-till not actually plowing a field better than plowing it, right? That seems contradictory to what we were raised with. He goes into the exact reasons why that happens, okay? So our next lecture is going to be on agriculture, biotechnology, and food. And I think you're going to really like where this is going. I have a deep interest in food and agriculture and biotechnology, and the way that soils kind of feed into the growing of crops and the taking care of people, and the way that our whole ecosystem operates and our interaction with it is really through the agricultural system. So I think you're going to really like where this goes. If you have any thing that you would like to add, put it in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.